The honourable member for Esquimalt, Saanich, Sooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the House. As I join this third reading debate on Bill C-16 today, I want to take this opportunity to mark the Trans Day of Remembrance, which will be taking place this Sunday, November 20th. This year marks the 17th annual Trans Day of Remembrance, which memorializes trans people who've been murdered over the past year. This year, we remember the more than 86 lives that were senselessly lost to transphobia and hate around the world and in Canada. We know that this number is only the tip of the iceberg, and that there are thousands of instances of violence perpetrated against trans people every year that go unreported or unrecorded. This Trans Day of Remembrance is not only a day to mourn, but a day for trans people, their loved ones and allies to come together and to grow our strength and resiliency on the road to ending transphobia once and for all. As people come together this Sunday across Canada and around the world, I want them to know that here in this House, we know trans people are still targets of violence and hate at undeniably troubling rates. We see the statistics about homelessness and suicide rates among trans and gender-diverse youth. We hear trans people when they say they still can't access necessary health care, and we hear trans people on the importance of being able to access appropriate identity documents. Passing Bill C-16, whether that's this afternoon or Monday, is just the start of working through the challenges that face trans and gender-diverse Canadians, but it is a vital first step. The federal government and its agencies will have to get busy making sure policies and practices respect the full and equal rights of transgender and gender-variant Canadians. I will spare the House an extended metaphor about Charlie Brown, Lucy, and the football, not only because of its rigid gender stereotypes and also because of its deeply embedded misogyny where the problems of men are always caused by women, but nevertheless, I have to use that analogy to say that the trans community is justifiably frustrated as we are now on the way to the third passage of this bill through the House of Commons. And what other group in Canadian society has had to wait while this House of Commons passes 3 times a bill which would only recognize that they are entitled to the same rights and protections as all other Canadians? Now let me repeat the story of this journey of this bill through Parliament, hopefully for one last time. This bill was first introduced by former NDP MP Bill Sixay in 2005. He reintroduced it again in 2007, and again in 2009. And on this third attempt, although it took 2 years, in the spring of 2011, on his third attempt, Bill actually saw his bill passed by the House, only to see it die in the Senate when an election was called. When I was elected, I spoke with Bill, and he asked me, on behalf of the NDP caucus, to pick up that private member's bill and to take that struggle forward into what was a Conservative majority parliament, and therefore didn't look very promising for the bill. I introduced my version of the bill on September 21st, 2011. So I stand here now more than 5 years after we began my attempts to get this bill through. The bill was passed through the House of Commons on March 20th, 2013, with the support of, I believe it was 19 members of the Conservative caucus at that time. And that came as a bit of a surprise to many Canadians. But then it went off to the Senate, and what was even more surprising, that though the Senate had more than 2 years to deal with the bill, it failed to do so before the election was called, and for a second time, a bill guaranteeing equal rights and protection to transgender and gender-variant Canadians died in the unelected Senate. And so while this proposed legislation has been languishing before our federal parliament, some progress has still been made. And again, I would say that I would like to think that the debate here in this House has helped bring forward progress elsewhere. In the meantime, 9 provinces have adopted corresponding provincial human rights legislation. And I have to say, in my second reading speech, I miscounted, and it proves you should actually use notes for these things. But we've seen corresponding provincial human rights legislation first in the Northwest Territories, then in Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia in 2012, Newfoundland and PEI in 2013, Saskatchewan in 2014, Alberta in 2015, and British Columbia and Quebec this year in 2016. The issue of trans rights is not a partisan issue. Amendments to protect against discrimination on the basis of gender identity were proposed by NDP governments in Alberta, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, a Liberal government in PEI, and Conservative governments in Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. And those amendments to the provincial human rights codes in Quebec, Ontario, and BC passed with all parties' support. Nor is progress on trans rights limited to the Canadian context. And I want to say again that we have lost a chance by our delays here in this House to be a leader around the world. And now more than 18 countries have passed Canada up with explicit protections of the kind that are proposed in Bill 616. And the list is surprising in its diversity. These are not just Western European countries or North American countries. In fact, they reflect all cultures around the world. Argentina has in fact been the world leader in protection of the rights of transgender citizens and continues to be so. But the list also includes Uruguay, Bolivia, Spain, France, Ireland, Estonia, Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, Israel, Cyprus, Nepal, Australia, and New Zealand, among others. In the United States, 16 states plus the District of Columbia provide explicit protections for transgender residents. And there are some good signs amidst the gloom in the United States. The North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory, who had brought forward a bill to explicitly allow discrimination against the LGBT community, was defeated in those elections, and largely over what was called House Bill 2, which would have really gone against the American tradition of acceptance, toleration, and liberty by promoting discrimination against North Carolinians. Now, there is still some gloom. The President-elect Trump has promised to rescind Executive Order 13672, which President Obama put forward in 2014, which protected transgender and gender-variant Americans against workplace discrimination. And at the time, very interestingly, at the time Obama pointed out that he felt the U.S. government was lagging behind business in the United States, as almost all the Fortune 500 U.S. companies, the biggest 500 companies in the U.S., already had internal policies protecting transgender people against discrimination. And I have said before in speeches here that certain businesses in federal jurisdiction, in particular the TD Bank, has set an example of how to deal with employees as they go through a transition. And the Canadian Labour Congress has produced guides for transition in the workplace that it's made available to all its union members across the country. So again, others have moved forward faster than we have here in this Parliament. In fact, today we're here 11 years after the first introduction of this bill, nearly 5 years after it first passed, and coming up on 3 years since it passed in the previous Parliament. But some things have changed, and we now, in the recorded vote at second reading, saw nearly half of the Conservative caucus join the Liberals and New Democrats in supporting this bill. And what has really changed? I would say the most important change here is that it's become a nonpartisan issue. And that's due to the work of transgender and gender-variant activists who have been very vigilant about contacting their members of Parliament and talking to them about their stories and why they need the support of their members of Parliament to make sure that their rights and dignity are respected in this country. Far too many of these stories are indeed tragic, and I think I could spend a long time recounting those, but time is, of course, short today. I will just point out the study by Egal, published in 2011, called Every Class in Every School, to show the very severe impacts of transphobia on students in this country, where 90% of trans students reported hearing daily or weekly transphobic comments, and where 78% reported feeling unsafe at school. No, this bill doesn't directly affect schools as they fall under provincial jurisdiction, but it tells us the size of the problem we face in combating transphobia in this country. This is the last remaining gap in Canadian human rights legislation, and I do look forward to being filled by judicious and expeditious action by the new Senate. What the transgender and gender-variant community in this country is asking for are equal rights and dignity, the same rights and dignity that all other Canadians enjoy, nothing more, nothing less. I look forward to the passage of C-16 today or Monday, as I said, and I'm hoping the Liberal government can ensure swift passage through the Senate. As I mentioned, what other group has had to wait over a decade while the House of Commons passes legislation to affirm their rights 3 times? If this is not the time to guarantee equality for all Canadians, then when would that time be? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.